rotten pockets slopes towards the flaps, that opens on the lowest sump of all, and so in the contour every ditch is shaped, with one rim proud, the other dipping down. So in the end we came upon the point where one last building block had shattered away or sheared away. My lungs by now had so been milked of breath, that come so far I couldn't make it further. I flopped. In fact, when we arrived just there, now you must needs, my teacher said, shake off your wonted intolerance. No fame is won beneath the quilt or sunk in feather cushions. Whoever fameless wastes his life away, leaves of himself no greater mark on earth than smoke in air or froth upon the wave. So upwards, on and vanquish laboured breath, in any battle mind power will prevail, unless the weight of the body loads it down. There's yet a longer ladder you must scale. You can't just turn and leave all these behind, you understand. Well, make my words avail. So I got up, pretending to more puff than really I could feel I'd got within. Let's go, I answered. I am all strength and dash. Upwards we made our way along the cliff, poor narrow going where the rocks just out, far steeper than the slope had been before. Talking on I went, when issuing from the ditch beyond there came a voice, though one unfit for human words. I made no sense of it, but now I neared the arc that forms a span across that pocket. The speaker seemed much moved by raging ire. Downwards I bent, but in such dark as that no eye alive could penetrate the depths. Sir, I said, make for the other edge, and let us then descend the pocket wall. From here I hear, but do not understand. So too I see, yet focus not at all. I offer you, he said to me, no answer. Just do it. Noble demands by right deserve the consequence of silent deeds. So where the bridge head meets embankment 8, we then went down, pursuing our descent. So all that pocket was displayed to me, and there I came to see a dreadful brood of writhing reptiles of diverse kinds. The memory drains the very blood from me. Geryon has transported Virgil and Dante to the Malebolgia, or the rotten pockets in the Kirkpatrick translation, the funnel through to the depths of the Lake of Cocytus. We left Dante at the end of part 2 in the trenches with the Simoniacs, with Pope Nicholas III, and anticipating that Dante's nemesis, Boniface VIII, was destined to share the fate of Nicholas. Regarding the Malebolgia, I'm reading a quote here, or a series of quotes, from Dorothy L. Sayers. The Malebolgia is the image of the city in corruption, the progressive disintegration of every social relationship, personal and public, sexuality, ecclesiastical and civil office, language, ownership, counsel, authority, psychic influence, and material interdependence. All the medias of the community's interchange are perverted and falsified. What began with the sale of the sexual relationship and went on to the sale of the church and state, now the very money itself corrupted. Every affirmation has become perjury, and every identity a lie. Moving beyond the flatterers and the simoniacs, Dante reached the fourth bolgia, the trench for the sorcerers. The sorcerers' crime, as indicative of the entire eighth circle, is perversion and falsity, but directed against the wonders of God. It is the usurpation of God's prerogatives. The sorcerers identified by Dante are the augurs and the astrologers. For the augurs, they take one example being Eurypylus, and for the astrologers, one Guido Bonatti. In terms of the latter example, it further expresses this general feeling of condemnation of the court of Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen emperor, who was referred to by Nietzsche as Stupamudi. For all the wonders of his court, it seems that Dante has littered the Inferno with all of the members of it. Their fixed point of punishment is contortion. It is for the folly of false prophecy that their heads have been snapped around, blinded to what now lies in front. for attempting to bring themselves forward in time to ever march backwards. And I find this very interesting. It seems to hint, or at least anticipate, an irony of progressivism. In other words, those who are attempting to bring not just time in terms of prophecy, trying to arrive at events and falsify and deceive those about the future. It seems that the whole essence of contortion, being forced to look back, being forced to walk forever eternally back, almost like a return to the womb, as if you never existed. It seems that those who are trying to impose a new value set or an anti-Christian or post-Christian mindset, the whole progressive idea that things can never go backwards, things can only go forwards. Maybe in Dante's conception, these sort of people who think in terms of a post-Christian morality, but also think in terms of technology. It wasn't Isaac Asimov who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But again, if magic is part of this whole art of falsity, of sorcery, that it is in a way a perversion of the natural order, of the creation as per Genesis, as technology is meant to bring us forward, so too perhaps those who have become obsessed with technology and believe that further mechanization and innovation of this sort of stuff unbridled, without context, attempting to bring the world kicking and screaming back into some sort of forward momentum or era, are all bound to have their necks snapped, their faces sent back, and to march forever backwards. In the fifth Bulger, we had already the Simoniacs who had trafficked in ecclesiastical offices, and here now they are complemented by the corruption of political officers, the Baratas. They are the sticky fingers melded to the boiling pitch, the embodiment of their corrupt deeds as complementing the flatterers who are mired in filth, which represents the summation of, or what ultimately was the amounting, the substance of all of their flattery. So all of the deeds, the corruptions are embodied in the boiling pitch, the black tar. Going into the sixth Bulger, we see the hypocrites. They are draped in splendor, but they are condemned by the weight of their deceit. In some cases, they are nailed down. But of course, this isn't some sort of heroic sacrifice by the cross, but is the weight of their hypocrisy that has essentially condemned them to be seen, to be glorious, and yet to be immobile in the sense, to have essentially the paradox between the beauty of the presentation and the utter immobility and corruption of the form. And going on to the seventh, we go on to the idea of the thief as part of this overall sort of span of falsity and treachery. For the thief, the identity is robbed from them. It is consigned as they are forced to undergo a sense of immolation and ashen reformulation, where Dante refers to this as being phoenix life. We already see in the figure, the serpentine figure of Geryon, the serpents and the reptiles, as I mentioned at the beginning with that excerpt, are the ones essentially who are bound up with all the thieves, forcing them to undergo all these various transformations, as transformations are endemic throughout the entire Inferno. In the case of the thief explicitly, it is the idea that they are robbed of the identity in the same way that they were prepared to rob from others. The fact that they were so careless when it came to property, that the ultimate property, which is the possession of self, has been denied them. Coming to Bulger 8, we have counselors of fraud, but Dante decides to focus this on the tale of Odysseus, or Ulysses. For some reason, I find it very difficult, have always found it very difficult to pronounce Ulysses, so, but nevertheless, I'll try and stab at it. And here I'm reading from Canto 26. Rejoice, Florentia! You've grown so grand that over land and sea you'll spread your beating wings, and through the whole of hell your name resounds. Among those thieves and robbers there I found were 5 of your own citizens. I am ashamed, and you do not acquire by this great honour. Yet if we dream near dawn of what is true, then you, not long from now, will surely feel what Prato aches to see for you, others as well. And were it now, it would not be too soon. Would it were so, as rightly it should be, It weighs me down, the more that time drags on. We now moved off, and climbing by those stairs that going down had bleached us ivory, my leader mounting up pulled me along, and so proceeding on this lonely way, through splintered rocks and outcrops from the ridge, feet without hands would not have gained advantage. It grieved me then, it grieves me now once more, to fix my thoughts on what I had witnessed there. Now more than usual, I must hold my mind back, lest brain should speed where virtue does not guide. Thus, if by some propitious star or more I've come to good, I best not make it void. A farmer leaning on his hillside rests, this countryman, as now the fly makes for the mosquito, sees there below him on the valley floor, where he perhaps will plough, the gather grapes, glowworms in numbers, such as now I saw glittering around the dip of pocket 8, when I arrived here, looking to its depths. Compare also in the Book of Kings, Elisha, once avenged by furious bears, beheld Elijah's chariot drawn away by horses rising to the heavens straight. His eyes, unable to pursue, could see only the flame like cloud wisp rising high. So too within the gullet of that ditch these fires move round. None shows its thievery, yet each fire stole something, sinning soul away. I stood there on the bridge and craned to look. Indeed, had I not clutched nearby rock, I surely would have, unpushed, have fallen in. My leader, who had seen now how hard I gazed, informed me now, in these fires are souls, each one is swaddled in its inward blaze. Well, sir, I answered, to be told by you, I am of course the surer. Myself, though, I had already thought of that, but though I meant to ask, who comes within the cloven-crested flame that seems to rise as from the pyre where one Eteocles was laid beside a brother slain? Within this flame, so he now said, suffering, are Ulysses and Diomed. As one they face their nemesis, as they in rage were once within their flame, their crime is now bewailed. Of those whose cunning wrought the Trojan horses, the door that freed the noble seed of Rome. They mourn as well the ruse by which, though dead, young Deidamer must weep Achilles' loss. They punish too for theft of sacred statues, if they within their tongues of fire can speak. I beg you, sir, I said, and beg again. So may each prayer be worth 1,000 more, that you do not forbid my waiting here, until that flames with horns has come this way. You see I bend to it with the greatest desire. Your prayer, he said, is worthy of great praise, and I most willingly accede to it. But you must keep your tongue in tight control. Leave me to speak, for I know very well what you desire. Now, nor would these two be quick, perhaps, to hear your words. They are both Greek, and when the flame has reached in time and place a point at which my leader thought it fit, I heard him form his utterances thus: O you there, two within a single flame, if I, when living, won in your eyes merit, if merit, whether great or small, I won in penning my exalted lines of verse, do not move on. Let one of you declare, where lost he went to come upon his death, the greater of those horns of ancient flame began to tear and waver, murmuring, as fires will do when struggling in a wind, during its pinnacle this way, and that as though this truly were a tongue that spoke, it flung its utterance out, declaring, once I set my course from Circe. No tenderness for son, no duty owed to aging fatherhood, no love that should have brought my wife Penelope delight, could overcome in me my long desire, burning to understand how this world works, and know of human vices, worth, and valor. In coming to the story of Odysseus, which of course informs the overall condemnation Dante has for him in terms of trickery. Again, the original sin that Odysseus should be responsible for the Trojan horse, and by extension that Troy be the seed of Aeneas and the creation of the kingdom of Alba Longa, and ultimately the predecessor to Roman civilization and the line of Julius Caesar. So within this grand conception of antiquity, which is the inheritance of Virgil, who is accompanying him here, not just physically, but also intellectually as the pilgrim, Ulysses is damned, but also in terms of understanding the symbolism here, which I actually believe there is so much of the Odyssey in looking at the structure of the Inferno. I want to look into the idea of the Nekia, which is by right by which ghosts were called upon to question about the future, which is a Greek cult practice, something similar to the idea of katabasis. They offer the opportunity to converse with the dead, and it can also be seen as a physical journey. It is a physical journey to the underworld, and it is one taken by several heroes in Greek and Roman myth, and of course one of these is Ulysses. What does this remind you of necessarily? Taken from the Odyssey, Odysseus makes the journey of this. He goes into the hall of Hades. He consults with the priest, the prophet Tiresias, about his potential returning home to Ithaca. And this is set within the whole midst of ghosts, dark blood, and eerie noises. Countless shades, dead and gone, surging around him. Again, the idea that it is not some sort of innocent pursuit to go down into Hades or to go down into the Inferno. As Dante is beset by so many horrors, so is Odysseus, or so is Ulysses. Returning from the underworld, from Hades, it represents a accomplishment. It is a heroic endeavor, in the same way that when Dante shall proceed downwards to the final circle within the Lake of Coctus, that he then embarks upon his own elevation to purgatory and then to heaven. It is a similar heroic endeavor as Ulysses himself was partaking of. However, when one goes to the underworld, in the case of Ulysses, it is for the sake of not just consulting with Tiresias, but also for the need to make a sacrifice, to summon the spirits for knowledge. Indeed, as Virgil, of course, is accompanying Dante for the sake of not only illuminating him regarding the state and the structure of hell, but also illuminating him as to what he should avoid and making himself aware regardless of his own propensity to sin. But of course, this isn't some sort of great act of repentance when it comes to the figure of Odysseus. And of course, this whole process is also mirrored in the Aeneid as well, talking about the Virgil inspiration as well. Of course, the Odysseus and Aeneas being parallels in the sense, one being the betrayer, one being the tricker of Troy, which allowed for the original decimation, and one being the refugee from Troy. This being Aeneas. From this, Odysseus has to make his way past Scylla and Chabdis, and thereafter he is followed by punishment visited upon the crew by Zeus at the island of Phrynakia. All of this is to say that not only are there obvious inspirations regarding the Odyssey, which are very apparent in terms of reading, in terms of understanding the nature of knowledge, of pilgrimage, of a descent, but most of all, the Commedia as a story of Nostos. It is the adventure, it is the journey. But of course, as the pilgrim, being Dante, is involved in his own moral journey, it is a journey of self-reflection as much as a physical journey. In the case of Odysseus, Dante is drawing to the fact that Odysseus was actually spurning what he should have been doing, which is returning to Ithaca, which is to enter into his essentially pre-Christian, nevertheless religious vocation of marriage, and to be there for his son. But of course, what Dante is accusing him here, as probably we see by his long elopement with the goddess Calypso, is that Odysseus has been corrupted by the process of wandering, and indeed he has corrupted others through his trickery, through the usage of the Trojan horse. But of course, we also talk about this idea of Xenia, which is appropriate here in terms of summoning this ritual to bring a source of wisdom and a source of prophecy to help and guide you. And of course, Odysseus falters, he fails the prophecy which has been set out for him. And of course, Virgil and Beatrice here represent the equivalent form of Nekia for Virgil. But moving on from this, in the ninth Bolgia, we are witnesses to the perpetrators of discord, those who incite civil war, schism, religious strife, political quarrels. Mohammed, for his crimes against Christianity, is here being ripped apart, and to read from Canto 28. Where every lopped off limb or part pierced through, seen once again, that even so would far from equal all the foul display in the ninth pocket. One I saw riven from his chin, to no barrel mid-slat or moon rib missing, ever I am certain, gaped as wide as that. Between his legs his guts all dangled down, innards and heart on show, and that grim bag that turns to shit, whatever gullets swallow. My eyes were fixed and gazed on him alone, and he gazed back. Then opening up his thorax, hands at work, look now, he said, how wide I spread. You see how mangled is the great Mohammed. In terms of that, not just disgusting imagery, the whole purpose of that is, again, as with everything Dante, it is meant to be a metaphor for the state of religious harmony, become religious discord. It is a historical indictment on Muhammad for breaking essentially the fabric of Christendom. And of course, looking at this from the point of view of Dante as an imperial ideologue of the Romans, within a few decades after the death of Muhammad, the Rashidun Caliphate had shorn off about half of the territory of the Eastern Roman Empire. And within a few decades after that, the Umayyad caliphs were laying siege to Constantinople itself. And indeed, by this time, Constantinople had been sacked by the Crusaders, but it was to the point of becoming encircled. The Ottomans were finally coming to existence around the time that Dante is writing the Inferno. In fact, if I remember correctly, Osman became Bey in the year 1299, but again, this is just a point in terms of Dante's own conception of religious discord and how Muhammad has invited discord upon Christendom. In the case of one Bertrand de Bon, he becomes an archetype of the headless knight, decapitated owing to his encouraging of the rebellion against the young Prince Henry, against Henry II of England. Discord here is compounded with severing of the bonds of filial piety. It is the perversion of the family and the violation of the fifth commandment. For to attack the head, who is both the king and the paterfamilias, the father of the family, Bertram has lost his head. The corollary to the horrors of the ninth Borgia are the diseases that have been inflicted upon the falsifiers in the 10th. Among here, we see the alchemists. The alchemists, interestingly enough, have been separated from the sorcerers, who are considered by Dante to be the diviners. But nevertheless, here they represent a similar perversion, the perversion of miracles, which are wonders to perform by God alone. At the base of the 8th circle, there is a well of giants, Nimrod, Briareus, Ephialtes, Antaeus, etc., which I will return to with a Butler article at the end. At the bottom of the well lies Coctus, a circular lake of concentric circles reserved for the traitors. Again, using Doré etchings in terms of being able to illustrate this point. Within these concentric circles, the outermost one is Cana, fratricide, named after Cain, brother of Abel, who murdered his brother as a result of his unquenchable jealousy. And of course, Cain is the first murderer, having been essentially the scion of Adam and Eve, who of course were the first to sin. The sin is compounded by Cain, and thereafter all of his progeny bear the mark of Cain. And so he is contained within his own circle of the lake, which is that of Cana. Then moving on, there is Antenora, treason to the nation. Antenor of Troy, mirroring again back to Ulysses, Odysseus, and the place in the eighth circle he has won by trickery, by bringing in the Trojan horse to allow for the armies under Agamemnon and the Greeks to sack the city. Antenor, as being a traitor to Troy, of course, is not only afforded a place within the ninth circle, of course, but he has given his name to that of treason to the nation. It has become ubiquitous for Dante, as with Virgil, as with his Romanophilia. Everything seems to come back to the original journey of Aeneas. Then we come to Ptolemaea, which is the violation of guest rights. By Ptolemaea, this isn't referring to Ptolemy Soter, the pharaoh who many of you may be aware of, but one Ptolemy of Apsus, who murdered his father-in-law, Simon Tassi. Then finally, we come to the center of hell, Judaea, treason to the Lord. And here I'm going to be reading from Canto 34, which is the last canto of the Inferno. Vexilla regis produent inferni, which essentially means, behold the banners of the king of hell, marching towards us. Fix your eyes ahead, my teacher said, and see if you can see it, as though a windmill when a thick fog breathes, or else when the dark night grips our hemisphere, seen from a distance, turning in the wind, so there a great contraption has appeared, and now I shrank against the wind behind my guide. There were no glades to shelter in. I was by now, as I write this verse in fear, where all the shades and ice were covered up, transparent as are straws preserved in glass. Some lay there flat, and some were vertical, one with head raised, another soles aloft, another like a bow bent face to feet, and then when we had got still further on, where now my master chose to show to me that creature who had once appeared to be fair, he drew away from me and made me stop, saying, Now see, great Dis, the city of hell, now see the place where you will need to put on all your strength. How weak I now became, how faded, dry reader, don't ask, I shall not write it down, for anything I said would fall far short, again, in terms of Dante actually being there within the context of the icy plain, as you can see in this image. I neither died nor wholly stayed alive. Just think yourselves if your minds are in flower what I became, bereft of life and death. The emperor of all these realms of gloom stuck from the ice at midpoint on his breast, and I am more giant to compare than any giant measure to his arm. So now you'll see how huge the whole must be when viewed in fit proportion to that limb. If once he was as lovely as now vile, when first he raised his brow against his maker, then truly grief must all proceed from him. How great a wonder it now seemed to be to see the three faces on a single head, the forward face with bright vermilion, the others two attached themselves to that along each shoulder on the central point, and joined together at the crest of hair. The rightward face was whitish, dirty yellow, the left in colour had the tint of those beyond the source from which the Nile first swells. Behind each face there issued two great veins, all six proportioned to a fowl like this. I never saw such size in ocean's sails, not feathered as a bird's wings are, bat-like and leathery, each fanned away the air, so three unchanging winds moved out from him. Coctus being frozen hard by these, he wept from all six eyes, and down each chin both tears and bloody slobber slowly ran. In every mouth he mangled with his teeth, as flax combs do, a single singing soul, but brought this agony to three at once. Such biting, though affects the soul in front, as nothing to the scratching he received. His spine at times showed starkly bare of skin. That one up there condemned to greater pain is Judas Iscariot, my teacher said. His head inside, his feet out, wriggling hard. The other two, their heads hung down below, are Brutus, dangling from the jet-black snout. The other Cassius with burly look. But night ascends once more, and now it's time for us to quit this hole. We've seen it all. As he desired, I clung around his neck. With purpose he selected time and place, and when the wings had opened to the full, he took a handhold on the Fury's sides, and then, from tuft to tuft, he travelled down between the shaggy pelt and frozen crust. But then arriving where the thigh bone turns, the hips extended to their widest there, my leader, with the utmost stress and strain, swivelled his head to where his shanks had been, and clutched the pelt like someone on a climb. So now I thought, we're heading back to hell. Take care, my teacher said. By steps like these, breathless and panting, seemingly all in, we need to take our leave of so much ill. Coctus, the wailing stream of Hades, or the loud lamentations of Milton's Paradise Lost, the body of water where the free giant Antaeus brings the pilgrim, is not a river, but a lake, though stemming from the rivers of tears from the old man on Mount Ida on Crete, which was meant in the sense of antiquity to be the center of the universe, or the center of the world more appropriately, that being between separate planes and Middle Earth. I don't want to get into too much of a tangent there. The tears here are representing defeat. Some have interpreted the old man as representing the progression of history. In this case, something I would identify as history as being nothing but a series of defeats. The tears as representing defeat are manifested here in Dante's imagination as the source of the bottommost prison of ice. The tears representing the loudest lamentation back to Milton, and they become here absolute silence and stillness. The circular lake of concentric circles allows for Dante to take his classical inspiration from Virgil and to situate it within the first circles, dis, the rotten pockets, as the recurring motif. Though all the imprisoned in Coctus are encased in ice, a bitter mercy is shown in Cana, who can shield themselves from the freezing winds and mercy, not shown in Antenora, where the heads are exposed yet immovable. It is Antenora where Dante displays the worst of his contempt and condemnation, as he is surrounded by traitors from the Guelph and the Ghibelline conflicts, which informs so much of Dante's pseudo-autobiography, if you're going to interpret the Commedia that way. Boccia degli Abbati is consigned here as a traitor specifically to the city of Florence and to Guelph. The sin in Ptolemaea is so severe that the living here are condemned to the circle without the consolation of weeping. Their tears, as with the original tears which form the rivers of hell that form the lake, are frozen in their eye sockets as crystal visors. The soulless bodies left above become hosts for demons. As for the denizens that Dante has decided to situate, Judas Iscariot, of course, is the traitor against Christ. Brutus is the traitor against Julius Caesar, and within Dante's entire historical conception, that Augustus Caesar was the most serene, legitimate authority upon which could deliver Christ the most legitimate punishment, being the Roman Empire and being of the Julian dynasty. In this case, Brutus here, for his betrayal of that dynasty, for the betrayal, you can say, of what the Aeneid was cocked up to produce, which, to put it very cynically, was Augustan propaganda and the deification of Julius Caesar. It therefore seems appropriate that Dante would assume that Brutus would occupy a similar place to Judas Iscariot. But of course, we come to Satan himself. In terms of describing this, I'm reading from a short segment from the Cambridge Companion by Peter S. Hawkins. The last person Dante meets in hell, Satan, is in several ways the antithesis of the first, and in the most graphic way possible embodies the worst of sin. Perhaps the most striking feature of this gigantic feature is the pain he internally inflicts through his unremitting gnawing of Brutus, Cassius, and Judas in his massive mouths. Dante would certainly want us to gaze steadily on the horror, but what he wants his reader never to forget about sin is the pain it inflicts on individuals, and the rending it causes in human society. This has been made clear from the first circle of sinners, the lustful, or first circle of sinners proper, which is actually the second circle to make it sound more convoluted. Whatever our response to Francesca's self-justification, and we learn more about that in part 1, we are left in no doubt that even lust, the softest of sins, sprinkles the world with blood. The lesson is driven home time and time again in the journey down through hell, and if occasionally we recoil from the sheer savagery of Dante's depiction, we do well to remember that he, too, knew whereof he spoke, for the circumstances of his daily life in exile brought home to him the cruelty of a society torn apart by evil, hence all of the references to his own life and the political turmoil which Italy found itself in the late 13th century and the early 14th century. The silent Satan then tells out aloud and clear the pain sin inflicts on others, but this wordless figure speaks no less clearly of the harm sin causes to the self. For Satan is once splendid being, indeed the most perfect of God's creatures, from whom all personality has now drained away. The movement of his jaws, the beating of his wings are purely mechanical. Even the ability to move about, that modest prerogative of animal life, is now beyond him. Dante's last word in hell on sin is then in every sense damning, intended by the sinner to be an assertion of self, a forward thrust. Sin, in Dante's eyes, is the ultimate denial of the self, the immobilizing of personality. For at its worst, it denies that love which quickens the spirit. It is entirely apt that the greatest sinner should spend eternity locked in the ice of his own creation. Satan is in many ways, but not in every way, the antithesis of Virgil, for he conveys, at its sharpest, the ultimate and universal pain of hell: isolation. Satan is, of course, isolated from his own kind, as Virgil is not. We have seen the respect with which the latter was welcomed back into the family of the poets, itself part of the larger community, company of noble spirits. Nor does Virgil suffer from the active self-isolation through the infliction of pain on others, which Satan shares with so many of the sinners in hell. But for Dante, the deepest isolation is to suffer separation from the source of all light and life and warmth, and to that isolation the pathos of Virgil and the fatuity of Satan bear witness in their different ways. It's here I want to move on and compare the immobilized Satan, the Satan shorn of all personality, the Satan here which is the most exalted and beautiful of all God's creations, which is being condemned to that of a fate worse than an animal, to what many people have basically interpreted as the inverse, which is Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost. Here I'm reading from Irene Samuel's book, the Commedia in Paradise Lost. As with all of the citations, essays, and everything I use or cite in these episodes, you can find this in the description. Those who have insisted on the utter disparity between Milton's Hell and Dante's Inferno have generally discounted or disparaged the excrescences in Paradise Lost, the allegory of sin and death, the building of the causeway from hell to earth, and the transformation of Satan and his crew into serpents. Indeed, Milton had been concerned to allow dignity to evil, as those who contrast his concept with Dante so often assert. He would have been repelled by the vulgar blasphemies and grotesque monsters of the Inferno, and having avoided anything like that in his own poem. But apparently, Milton too intended that hell should be presented as ultimately, even if not initially, repellent. He was evidently impressed by the concept in Dante's lines: "If he was once as beautiful as he is ugly now, and lifted up his brows against his Maker, well may all affliction come from him." Since the corruption of the best is the worst, the former beauty and the present ugliness measure the distance between the initial perfection of the created being and the monstrous products of the will. In both Dante and Milton, it is the evil will that brings about evil. Dante uses the explanatory phrase in Purgatorio, where Buonaconte says of the devil that had claimed his body, he united the evil will which seeks ill only with intellect. In Inferno itself, the damned are the wretched people who have lost the good of intellect. Both phrases accord with Milton's view that evil will use intellect to evoke evil, and thus loses the good of intellect. Milton treats the question both dramatically and allegorically. Satan's approaches of the persuasion to Beelzebub and his assembled followers at the outset of the war in heaven show the evil willing to make use of intelligence. By the time Satan reports on his conquest of Eden, the evil he has willed has cost him his intelligence. And at points between now we can note the progressive distortion of thinking by his resolve to make evil his good. Just to emphasize for the people who may appreciate that the idea to lose the goodwill of intellect, that from the showing of the will making use of intelligence, the cost essentially ultimately becomes the intelligence to the distortion of thinking and resolve. The allegory of sin and death gives opportunity for a fuller account of the process by which the perverse will have summoned evil into being. The Dantean quality of the allegory may be gauged by the resemblance of certain of Milton's phrases for its chief personages to those used by Dante for the grotesque guardians of hell. Satan's blazing eyes may owe more to Virgil than to Dante's Charon. But it is Dante who tries to oppose the divine will and speaks words that apply to both Dante's hell and Milton's. Sin, as we have noted, confounding the human and the reptilian, resembles Geryon. Beyond this, sin gnawed at from within by her hell brood is reminiscent of the Minotaur in the Inferno. Death grins horribly, like Minos. He has a ravenous maw. Like the three heads of Cerberus, he is monstrously indistinct of shape. Like the fused bodies of Chiampha and the serpent Agnello, and exercises a petrifying power like Medusa's. Together, sin and death are become the scavengers of evil in the world, even as Inferno is its cistern. The images are all deliberately far more repellent than those in Virgil of Tisiphone guarding the gates of hell, or Tityos gnawed by the vulture. The episode involving them is no less grotesque. Sin conceived as an idea in the satanic mind, his wisdom, as it were, become a reality when mating with her, he began the war in heaven. Wisdom and mating with wisdom is a reference to Greek mythology, the idea of Zeus mating with Metis. Thereafter, Metis was contained within a part of Zeus himself, which represented wisdom. This, to me, is also the origin of the conscience, and also it is the origin point of the goddess Athena. Just for people who wanted me to expand a bit more on what it meant by wisdom and mating with wisdom. By a sympathetic motion, she fell with his falling armies, already pregnant with death, at whose birth, after she arrived in hell and took her place as its wardeness, her never shape thus grew, transformed. Pun suggests at once the transformation of her nether parts into a reptilian shape and her assumption of the shape appropriate to the netherworld. Has Satan not fallen in love with his misconceived brainchild, that is, decided to make war in heaven, all the unnaturalness of evil symbolized by the ancestral union would never have been. Once the initial anti-natural choice was willed, all else that followed, perversion on perversion, was already implicit as consequence in that choice. With the emergence of death, crowned king of hell at his birth, the anti-nature of the whole realm of evil is emphasized. Sin undergoes her monstrous metamorphosis. Death at once incestuously rapes her and begets the whole hell brood of further evils that multiply hourly conceived and hourly born, constantly returning to sin's womb to gnaw at her entrails. None of this was part of the created cosmos. Only the initial perversity of willed evil could have brought it into being. Sin's birthday might have been her death day, had Satan not mated with her. At first sight she filled him, as did everyone who beheld her, with horror. But then, as she puts it, familiar gown I pleased, very much as the siren of Dante's second dream in the Purgatorio, became alluring to his continued gaze. But the siren and the dream vanished when Virgil uncovered her loathsomeness. Satan, on the contrary, found his siren daughter increasingly attractive. The allegory of sin and death in Paradise Lost is thus not less grotesque, less grimly comic, less melodramatic than many of the scenes of the Inferno. The building of the causeway through chaos again involves a Dantean allegory. Sin burrowing her way like a mole recalls Gerion's arrival and descent. Death smiting the shored-up soil with his mace petrific, and binding it with his look of Gorgonian rigour, recalls the danger to the beholder of the presence of Medusa at the outworks of the city of Dis, and the freezing of the sinners into the permanent distortions of the lower circle, the bridge itself, of length prodigious, a passage broad, smooth, easy, inoffensive, down to hell, recalls the arches and varying states of disrepair in the latter hell that Dante traverses with Virgil, when sin assures Satan, O parent, these are thy magnificent deeds, thy trophies, thou art this author and prime architect. The phrase, as noted, recalls Dante. Its meaning is even more Dantean, as in the Inferno, all the motions of evil in the world proceeding from the 6 wings of Satan ceaseless in their bat-like flapping. So for Milton, all the ills which sin and death will now lose on the world spring from the author all ill. The grotesque exchanges between the daughter-wife and the father-husband hardly bear out the common critical view of the dignity of Milton's infernal beings. Our last view of sin and death is again Dantean. As the hellhounds drawn forth by God, they will be put to fittingly grotesque use, to lick up the draught and the filth, which man's polluting sin with taint have shed, on what was pure till crammed and gorged nigh burst with sucked and glut offal at one sling of the victorious arm well-pleasing sun, both sin and death and yawing grave at last, through chaos hurled, obstruct the mouth of hell for ever and seal up his ravenous jaws. The sudden shift from their self-estimate to God's view of them has an effect like the reversed view of Satan's Inferno in the Canton 34. Sudden inverted, the terrifying becomes the absurd. Before that ultimate absurdity, however, the hellish kingdom founded in Paradise Lost may come to be more like Dante's city-state of Dis. It already has a walled city, a grand building, the Plutonian Hall of Pandemonium, unmistakably Baroque in design, is perhaps intended to recall St. Peter's in Rome, much as Dante associates the red buildings in Inferno 8 with the mosques of Islam, to assign the hell of the architecture of an imicable religion, is among many of Dante's touches to Milton's Netherworld. Of course, in terms of understanding the Baroque and the association with Rome, Dante is writing this within the beginning of the 14th century. Indeed, it's often attested to the year 1300 in terms of the origins of the Inferno. Milton is writing this 350 years later within the context of the English Civil War. When Dante is thinking of earthly examples to draw inspiration in architecture, looking to red buildings and mosques of Islam, the period we're talking about is that of the rise of the Turks, that of the Golden Horde, that of the various caliphates out of Islam, that of the Ayyubid dynasty, that of the Mamelukes, and of course that of the Barbary Corsairs, and you can say the kingdoms of Al-Andalus, which had only just been able to begun receding a few decades before Dante was born in the 1250s and the 1260s. So for Dante, the enemy is very much associated with Islam, which is very made obvious in terms of the consigning of Muhammad to the 8th circle, and indeed probably offering him the most grotesque and unabashed admonition there. But of course, Milton, writing this as a Protestant and writing this from the point of view of English, he does not, from England, he doesn't look at Islam as the great temporal enemy here. He sees the Baroque as the great enemy, as Croce would a few hundred years later in Eta Barocca from an aesthetic point of view. But here, from Milton's point of view, Rome is the whore of Babylon. It is the seat of the Antichrist. So yes, there are definitely architectural inspirations and allusion here, but this is why people try to clash Dante with Milton so much in terms of coming from very distinct religious denominations, even though in Dante's day, this form of puritanical Anglican Protestantism had not even been conceived of. Pandemonium, of course, has the facade of dignity that the city of Dis lacks. But everywhere behind the facade is evidence of the foulness that lurks only waiting to become manifest. Those careless readers who suggest that the stench of Dante's Inferno is the kind of thing Milton avoided have evidently ignored the ever-burning sulphur unconsumed. Belial declares that they will all adjust to the noxious vapour of the realm, and Mammon, in his crassness, not only does not miss the ambrosial odours of heaven, but fully expects all aspects of hell to become agreeable, our temper change it into their temper. Just before his seduction of Eve, Satan is compared, one long, impopulous city pent, where houses thick and sewers annoy the air. The simile gains force because hell is already such a city, though less pompous than the turn of events in the book 9 will presumably make it. Satan's first recourse from the natural pleasure at finding himself in the countryside has been to descend to the body of a serpent, a body which, in a startling scene, he resumes in hell. Along with the Dantean allegory of sin and death, and the bridge from hell, the transformation of Satan and his followers into the serpents has been judged inappropriate to Paradise Lost. But apparently Milton thought decorum called for such a scene, if the meaning of evil was finally to be made clear. The evident analogue to this transformation is that of the thieves in Inferno 24-5, and Dante's passage may confirm the proprietary and significance of Milton's as well as the insight with which, from large readings and meanings from the Inferno, by the transformation, the consummation of the themes by fire, the consumption of them by fire, the phoenix-like ashen transformations having been essentially forever embroiled amongst reptilian creatures and serpents of the like. In Paradise Lost, Satan, returning from what he thinks a wholly successful expedition, gives his triumphant report to the council of the chief devils in Pandemonium. And just when he expects, and they are about to give their applause, he hears himself hissed, sees his audience transformed into serpents, and finds himself similarly transformed. Then, as they go to join the lesser devils waiting outside the hall, these too, after their first astonishment, are changed. Compulsively, they swarm through a valley thronged with serpents of every kind. Where sham trees have sprung up compulsively, they climb and eat, though the fruits turn to dust and ashes in their mouths. Satan had chosen to descend into a serpent, had created a sham serpent to deceive the mother of mankind, Eve, had pretended to have eaten a sham tree when supposedly magical fruit, which must, he knew, turn to dust and ashes in Eve's mouth. Now he is compelled to be the serpent he then chose to be, and to eat the fruit he then only feigned to have eaten. And since his followers, greater and lesser, were content that he should engage in the exploit, and were ready to applaud and share its fruits, they must now share in the transformation and the eating. All that he did as their representative, they are now bound to reenact with him. As Arnold Stein has pointed out, it is significant that Satan's transformation follows that of his lieutenants, proving him the leader led. The details in the triple sequence of metamorphosis are thus not merely ornamental, they have been placed in the passage because of their significance. The passage from Ovid, generally taken as a source of Milton's and explicitly cited by Dante, as I've been at pains to say, had no comparable meaning. Cadmus prayed to be transformed into a serpent. His wife prayed for the same transformation. Their prayers were granted. As of yore, they neither fear mankind nor wound them, mild creatures remembering that once they were in the passage in Lucan, also cited by Dante, and regarded as one of Milton's sources, is little more than a list. But Satan and his followers are not the mere reptilian varieties of Lucan, or the mild and harmless creatures of Ovid. Only Dante could have suggested to Milton the idea of having the scene represent the penalty exacted by divine justice, that the criminal must go on being and doing involuntarily what he formerly was and did by choice, the idea of fixity in hell, and that of the sin enslaving man, and the man essentially becoming the sin. Dante's hell is entirely peopled with those condemned endlessly to reenact what they had chosen to do on earth. In Inferno, the equation of crime with penalty is subtly worked out in three kinds of transformation suffered by the three kinds of thieves. The serpent image, with its suggestions of fraud and slipperiness and malevolence, clearly befits the nature of thieves, just as the elaborate thief image of Paradise Lost befits Satan. As a thief bent to unhoard the cash of some rich burgher as in Bürgerliche, not burger as in anyway, whose substantial doors, cross-barred and bolted fast, fear no assault, in at the window climbs, o'er the tiles so clomb this first grand thief into God's fold. Satan began his exploit like a thief. It is appropriate that he should end the boastful account of his success by being transformed, like one of Dante's thieves, into a serpent, since the transformation of Dante's thieves is intended to suggest the likeness of their crime to that of the old serpent himself. Of the three scenes Dante witnesses in the valley, the first occurs when one of the thieves is suddenly bitten in the throat by a snake, whereupon he at once burns to a heap of ashes, and then as suddenly resumes his human shape. The figure is Vanni Fucci, thus punished for his sacrilege in robbing the sacristy at Pistoia, and for the merciless accusation that caused another to be punished for his crime. After maliciously prophesying defeat for Dante's party in the civic broils of Florence, Vanni proceeds to blaspheme in word and gesture. He is stopped by two serpents, one coiling itself around his throat, the other tying his hands behind him. Presumably his burning and resurrection represents a periodic visitation on those who now run about the valley with their hands bound behind them by serpents, for off he runs, he fled, speaking not another word. Then as suddenly three new thieves appear, and with them a six-footed reptile which attacks one of the thieves, linking body and body until the two are so fused that their former shapes are lost. And now another reptile comes darting along, bites another of the thieves, and begins the third metamorphosis. As serpent and thief eye each other, a cloud of smoke issues from each. Within the smoke they gradually exchange forms from head to foot until the one rose upright and prostrate, the other fell. Then the visages too change, reptilian into human, human into reptilian, until finally the soul that had become a brute fled hissing along the valley, and after it the other talking and sputtering. The first transformation is evidently the rarest kind in the valley. The second, probably less rare. The third, the commonest, for all the serpents are presumed former thieves, transformed thieves. Superficially, they share with Milton's scene little more than their common sources in Ovid and Lucan. It is the same way the three transformations support the meaning of Dante's valley of serpents represents Milton's. Milton reverses the sequence of the metamorphosis in Ovid as freely as Dante varies it. Since Satan's proceedings began with his head, first his visage turns reptilian, then his torso, then his legs, until he falls prone and trying to address his already transformed grand counsellors, finding himself hiss for hiss with forked tongue to forked tongue. The whole of hell resounds with din of hissing and swarms of complicated monsters. In a typical Miltonic pun, complicated suggests both the coilings and the contorted complicity of the fallen angels. As in Dante, the visual image signifies the idea. When Satan and his lieutenants go forth, the multitude waiting to see in triumph issuing forth their glorious chief, but beholding instead a crowd of ugly serpents scarcely have time for horror, so rapidly do they become like those they behold. Down their arms, down fell both spear and shield, down they as fast, and the dire hiss renewed, and the dire form caught by contagion, like in punishment, as in their crime. Again the image signifies the idea, as the lieutenants wishing to applaud could only hiss, since praise from that wicked is the worst condemnation. So these, having back Satan's decision to resort to fraud, lose even the appearance of the army that fought in heaven, and assume the very shape of what they encouraged their leader to become. The changes are not distinguished by Milton, as they are by Dante. His main point is that all the devils participated in one and the same crime with Satan, in his theft of man's appearance and man's happiness. They therefore undergo one and the same transformation. Those who might have stopped him, if they had not shared his purposes, are in fact even before he is, and those who merely went along with the rest now to go along. The metamorphosis is given in detail only for Satan, who remains still greatest and still midmost, when dragon grown larger than whom the sun engendered in the Pythian vale. Dante is not concerned with size, and he distinguishes more the sequence, but he too gives importance to the metamorphosis, catch by contagion. Chiefly, however, Dante discriminates three processes of becoming a thief. Vanni is bitten by a sudden impulse that consumes him for a moment. When he comes to himself again, far from repenting of the impulse, he can take comfort only in maliciously awaiting the destruction of others. The characterless Agnello is fastened upon by the accomplished thief Cianfa, and becomes one with him. The interchange of serpent and human form in the third transformation suggests two separate processes. The susceptible becoming spellbound by evil in the hardened thief, and the hardened thief seeking to regain touch with humanity by turning it into his own likeness. Most of this was irrelevant to Milton's purpose, though some of Dante's particular insights resemble his own concept. Thus, like Vanni, Satan is cut off in the midst of a blasphemy by the appearance of serpents. He has been boasting his success in an oddly literal-minded fashion. Man by fraud I have seduced, from his creator, and the more to increase your wonder with an apple, worth your laughter. True is me, also he hath judged, or rather me not, but the brute serpent, that which to me belongs, in enmity, which he will put between me and mankind, his seed, which is not set, shall bruise my head, a world who would not purchase with a bruise. Appropriately, the literal mind sees its former pretense turn into a literal fact. Dante's very way of meting out justice, again, like the commingling of the serpent Cianfa and Agnello, or like the exchange of a thief and serpent shapes in the climactic transformation. Milton's scene emphasizes the spreading of crime, sight and hearing, as Inferno, bite, and hypnotic stare serve to transmit the contagion. And the most hideous aspect of the entire episode in Dante, the ceaseless recurrence of the infection, is the one Milton drives home, the metamorphosis of Satan and his crew, the final appearance in Paradise Lost, with its annual recurrence prophesied. Then, in a characteristic shift of meaning, Milton relaxes the tension. The prophesied annual recurrence is, after all, only what some say, while others say the devils turned serpents flooded the earth. And the poet turns from the scene to show Satan's partly reptilian progeny, sin and death, arriving to lay Eden waste and make it an outpost of hell, fit for the serpent brood. In Inferno, Dante makes a like transition. In the first lines of Canto 26, he hails his native city, "Let Florence rejoice that she has thus colonized the Valley of Thieves." Thus he too links hell with this infected world. From Dante, Milton almost certainly drew the technique of juxtaposition and elaboration of images to convey an implied meaning. Neither poet merely depicts thievish devils or devilish thieves being turned into serpents, or sends them hissing through a valley, though even these details link the two scenes. Dante refers his reader to Ovid and Lucan, two of the poets, as it happens, who have welcomed him with Virgil into the castle of the enlightened heathen. But he himself makes of their mirror suggestions one of the most striking episodes in the Inferno. Little wonder, then, that his possibilities for his own devils struck Milton. Like Dante, he wished finally to emphasize the grotesque and the compulsive in hell. Reading through the Inferno, especially when coming to the well, which separates the eighth circle from the ninth circle, I've been constantly under the impression of the war between the Titans and the Olympians, the murder of the murder of Kronos, the murder of Uranus, the usurpation of Uranus by Kronos, and the conflict between the giants, the Titans, and the Olympians, and how much Dante is indebted to all of these examples of antiquity. And in terms of trying to understand that aspect of it more, in terms of looking at Milton and seeing this as part of a battle between the hosts of heaven and newly found hell and the hordes of pandemonium before all time, in an age before human beings were created, as it also exists in the case of Greek mythology, in terms of human beings essentially being the product of Zeus's will, Prometheus's formation of the clay, and the inspiration afforded through Athena, and later Prometheus's betrayal of Zeus and affording the fire of divine inspiration to humanity. All of these things are echoing throughout Dante's Inferno. And so I'm reading from George Butler's article, Giants and Fallen Angels in Dante and Milton. In Paradise Lost, Milton draws on the battle of the gods and the giants, recounted in various classical works to describe Satan and the fallen angels. While these ancient accounts were the primary source of Milton's mythology, the classical tradition was also available in medieval and Renaissance adaptations. One possible but overlooked source is Dante, which places the classical giants in a Christian hell. In Dante's epic, Milton could find a precedent for linking the fall of the giants and the fall of Satan. Milton's treatment of myth sometimes departs from his likeliest Greek and Roman sources. It most closely resembles Dante's Christianization of these ancient texts. Details of Dante's account match Milton's handling of the battle of the gods and the giants, and both Dante and Milton allude to the Gigantomachy in the way that suggests similar purposes. Milton's interest in Dante was early and exceptional, for during the 17th century, Dante was largely ignored even in Italy and rarely named in England. Milton studied Italy, and one of the reasons why it was largely ignored in Italy is partly as a result of some of his works, Dante's works, being included on the Index of Prohibited Literature, De Monarchia in particular, given the fact that Dante had more than a few things to say in regarding the Catholic Church and assigning various popes, very controversially, it should be pointed out, into designation of aspects of simony. And of course, given the fact that Dante was published around that same time that his works were being placed on the list, on the index, they were being placed on unauthorized printing presses throughout Germany. You can perhaps understand why there was a prejudice from the Baroque era in Italy against Dante. Milton studied Italian before 1625, and during his years at Cambridge, he acquired extensive knowledge of Dante, Petrarch, Ariosto, Boccaccio, Tasso, Boiardo, and other major Italian writers. In his Apology for Smentminus, 1642, he expresses his admiration of Dante and Petrarch, saying that above all artful, licentious authors, he preferred the two famous renowers of Beatrice and Laura, who never write but honour of them to whom they devote their verse, displaying sublime and pure thoughts without transgression. Though this reflection on the poet's studies is difficult to date, Milton French suggests that Milton was remembered his experiences at St. Paul's School, where he probably entered in 1620. As Irene Samuel has observed, Milton's reference to Dante is especially important, for Buonarroti was the leading Dante scholar of his time. Milton read the Commedia carefully, and he refers to it throughout his commonplace book. He used Dante for his entry on usury. He cites the Inferno and Daniello's commentary on the Canto. He may also have turned to the editions of the commentaries of Landino and Alessandro Velletullo, which were often reprinted during the 16th century. So great was Milton's understanding of Dante that David Mason claimed that Milton knew the Commedia better than any other Englishman alive. Milton may have continued to consult the Commedia when he was working on the epic. The Commonplace book offers a key to understanding how Milton used Dante in his epic poem. Milton references to the Commedia most often appear in his entries for various sins such as avarice, suicide, sloth, and usury. Milton observes Dante's descriptions of the torments of the damned, and he praises the Italian poet's insights. In his entry for death self-inflicted, for example, Milton writes that Dante's Inferno most skillfully describes the punishment of those among the inhabitants of the infernal regions. But while both Dante and Milton describe hell and heaven in some similar ways, the epic visions of each are fundamentally different. For Mason, Dante is subjective, while Milton is objective. Dante's poem grows out of personal experiences, while Milton chose to record an already existing subject. The difference is that the visual fantasy bequeathed by Dante was mainly a congeries of intense and intricate symbolisms of his own personality. Mason explains, whereas that offered by Milton was mainly a sublime vision of an independent objective tradition. Through their contrasting approaches, Dante and Milton populate their supernatural worlds in different ways. In his epic, Dante includes a number of contemporary and historical persons, along with figures of classical and biblical mythology. While Dante is the poet in the particular, Milton is the poet of the universal. Milton depicts heaven and hell before the dawn of human history. He rarely features historical characters in Paradise Lost. Instead, the demons are types of individual person. When he does mention historical figures such as Charlemagne or Galileo, he typically cites them in similes or as elusive modes. But in the comedy, Milton could find medieval exemplars of particular sins. When Dante presents a sinner, whether mythical or historical, he often provides more than a passing allusion by elaborating the circumstances and punishments of carefully chosen characters. The details provided by Dante clarify the vision of his poem and help account for the appeal of his cantos to Milton. Milton could borrow features from Dante's treatment of both historical and mythical beings, such as the giants, to embellish his portraits of Satan and the fallen angels, much as he registered admiration for Dante's descriptions of punishment in the Commonplace book. Milton first introduces the reader to the giants in Book 1 of Paradise Lost, where he describes the vanquished Satan. In bulk as huge, assume the fable's name of monstrous size, Titanian, earthborn, that warred on Jove, Briareros, and Typhon, whom the den by ancient Tarsus held. Several hundred lines later, he includes among the demons, Titan heaven firstborn, with his enormous brood and birthright seized, by younger Saturn, he from mighty Jove, his own and Rhea's son, like measure found. I do apologize in general for the flitting between Roman and Greek names. I'm more used to using Greek names, but of course, in terms of the Virgilian inheritance of all of this, we're going to be seeing a lot of Roman mythological names. So in this case, of course, Jove here is meant to be Zeus. Through allusions to the Titans, Briareos, and Typhon, Milton acquaints Satan with the fierce monsters of classical mythology. Commentators have generally acknowledged that Hesiod's Theogony was Milton's most influential source, and that Ovid's Metamorphoses and Conte's Renaissance mythology were also significant. Nevertheless, as Lewis has observed in her study of Milton's Promethean politics, there had been surprisingly little attention to Milton's reworking of the Titan and the Promethean iconography in Paradise Lost. While Milton's editors have noted that there are classical antecedents of his allusion to the Gigantomachy, they have disregarded Dante's role in Christianizing myth. As both pagan and pre-Christian compositions, the Theogony and the Metamorphoses do not relate the Titans and the giants to the story of Satan's fall. In the Theogony, Briareos emerges as an unlikely counterpart of Satan, for he does not fight against Zeus as Milton suggests. Instead, he joins his 100-handed brothers, Cottus and Gaius, in helping Zeus defeat the Titans. Aegeon joined with the other giants in rebellion against Jove. He then equates Aegeon with Briareos, though he cites Homer and Hesiod in calling Briareos as Jove's guardian. If Milton had the Conte and Virgil in mind, he would have been likelier to allude to Aegeon rather than to Briareos in his description of the fallen Satan. In Dante, though Milton could find clear parallels between Satan and Briareos, and between the giants and the fallen angels, as Dante Pilgrim winds his way through the lower depths of hell, he meets the giant Ephialtes. Virgil tells the pilgrim that this proud one chose to try his strength against supreme Jove. After seeing Ephialtes, the pilgrim says to the guide, "If it were possible, I should wish my eyes might have experience of the immense Briareos." Virgil explains that Briareos resembles Ephialtes, except being more terrifying. He whom you wish to see is far further on, and he is bound and fashioned like this one, except that he seems more ferocious in look. Typhon is in hell too, for Virgil tells Antaeus, "Do not make us go to TYDEUS, nor to Typhon." Dante thus situates Briareos, Typhon, and the other giants in classical myth within the Christian hell and in close proximity to Satan. As Dante's pilgrim works his way through the purgatory, Briareos is mentioned once again. The pilgrim walks over flat tombstones that are carved to illustrate the dead buried beneath them. Some of the stones depict fallen giants. I saw Timbreus, I saw Pallas, and I saw Mars, still armed around their father, gazing on the scattered limbs of the giants. The passage is an allusion to the battle of the gods and the giants from classical myth, with details borrowed from Statius's THEBAID. Immediately preceding this reference of the Gigantomachy, Dante says that Satan and Briareos are both carved on pairs of stones. I saw on the one side him who was created nobler than any other creature, fall as lightning from heaven. I saw Briareos on the other side, pierced by the celestial bolt, lying heavy on the ground in mortal chill. An engraving of Briareos is positioned alongside that of Satan, making the monster a classical counterpart to the fallen angel. The relief of Satan shows the angel falling from the heavens. The image of Briareos shows the aftermath of the fall. Milton and Dante both focus on Satan and Briareos as fallen beings, while Virgil in the Aeneid describes Aegeon's 100 arms and hands, 50 fire-breathing mouths, and violent battles against Jove without mentioning Jove's victory. This is referencing the Aeneid again. Statius comments on the ferocity of Briareos without describing Jove's triumph. But Milton's allusion to Briareos is part of his Leviathan's smile, in which Satan, extended long and large, lay floating many a road in bulk as huge as whom the fables name a monstrous size. At the close of a simile, Milton re-emphasizes Satan's proneness. So stretch out, huge in length, the arch-fiend, chained on the burning lake. The image recalls Dante's Briareos, grave, lying heavy on the ground in mortal chill. While Virgil, Hesiod, and Conti number the grotesque features of Briareus and Aegeon, Milton and Dante instead allude to the monstrous and enormous size. Dante describes Briareus only as being grave, heavy. The Leviathan simile in Paradise Lost shows that Satan is in bulk and huge as Briareus. Unlike Hesiod's 50-headed monster, Satan lies with his one head lifted up to the wave. Wise from the two hands, not 100 of the erect Miltonic Satan, the flames driven backwards slope on their pointing spires. Dante's Briareus too resembles Ephialtes or Antaeus, the anthropomorphic giant with whom Hercules had once fought. Although he is more terrifying, he does not have a grotesque featuristic of the Hesiodic monster. Since Ephialtes is two-armed, notes Stevens, Virgilio effectively denies that any giants were ever physiologically deformed. By extension of this interference, this would mean that Dante's Typhon was also human in shape. As with Briareus, Milton, like Dante, alludes to Typhon only to illustrate Satan's tremendous size, not to attribute a grotesque form. In the Comedy, Dante undertakes to correct inaccurate pagan conceptions of the giants' classical myth. The pilgrim learns that while the ancients stressed the physical deformities of the giants, their monstrous features were psychological rather than physiological. So too in Paradise Lost, Milton shows that the Ionian gods, the Titans, Briareus and Typhon, were all classical representations of Satan and the rebel angels. Satan can assume many physical shapes, though his substance remains the same. Both Dante and Milton approach the Gigantomachy as an imperfect rendering of Christian truth, and each poet illuminates the realities behind the ancient myth. While Christian truth serves to clarify the classical Gigantomachy, in both epics, Dante and Milton also use the battle of the gods and giants to demythologize the fall of the rebel angels. Dante's pilgrim undergoes a process of spiritual maturation and indoctrination. Indoctrination here as in literally to indoctrinate, as in to be well versed in doctrine, not indoctrination in terms of the pejoratives which become associated stemming from religious derision, in which the reader also participates, for the pilgrim represents humanity, and the truths revealed to him have universal significance. Sins are first depicted in the Inferno, and then cleansed in the Purgatorio. The Briareus of Dante's epic introduces the pilgrim and the reader to Satan. The monster is first mentioned when the pilgrim enters Coctus and asks for Briareus' name, enchanted by the idea of seeing the mythological monster with his 100 hands and 50 heads. Here sin does not repulse the pilgrim or the reader as it should. By way of correction, Dante strips away the captivating mythological features of Briareus and the other giants, making it clear that they all resemble humans except for their size. In this regard, rather than glorifying their enormity, their exaggerated comparisons, he relates the giants' proportions to the dimensions of the physical world. In the case of Nimrod, as long and huge as the pine, Canon St. Peter's at Rome and his other bones were in proportion with it. 3 Frieslanders would have trouble reaching his hair, but perhaps 4 could have done so, while the pilgrims saw 30 great spans of him down the place where a man buckles his cloak. Stood full 5 ells, not reckoning his head above the rock. With such the precise anthropomorphic descriptions, Dante removes the giants from the realm of fable and makes them less appealing to the imagination. Moreover, in introducing the pilgrim and the reader in Coctus, these giants define Satan's dimension and demythologize him in like manner. As small as the pilgrim is in relation to the giants are yet smaller in comparison to Satan. The emperor of the woeful realm stood forth from mid-breast out of ice, and I saw and compare better with the giants than giants with his arms, seeing how huge the whole must be to correspond to such a part. In the Purgatory, Dante's pilgrim and the reader learn further of the true nature of the giants and Satan. Not only divested of their physical uncanniness, both the giants and Satan are vanquished, powerless, and entombed as the carvings on the paving stones. As in the Commedia, Briareos and the other giants are the reader's first introduction to Milton's Satan. The monster's physical qualities delineate Satan's appearance. Their pride and ultimate failure bespeak his character and destiny. Additional details in Milton recall Dante's image of Satan who stands like a tower. Who had been the master to bind them, I do not know, but he had his right arm shackled behind him, and the other in front by a chain, which held him clasped from the neck downward, so that upon him uncovered part it was a wound as far as the fifth coil. Milton said that the tallest pine hewn on Norwegian hills to be the mast of some great admiral, where but a wand compared to Satan's spear. His imagery and direction recall Dante's Nimrod, who is compared to the pine cone of St. Peter's at Rome, and TYDEUS, who stands like the mast of a ship. Like Dante's Pilgrim, the reader of Paradise Lost is initially enthralled by Milton's fallen angel. But Paradise Lost, also like the Inferno, engages the reader in a process of theological discovery, so that by the end of the poem, the devil has lost glamour. Milton's allusions to the Gigantomachy in the Leviathan, similarly, initiate this process of revelation. For like Satan, the rebellious giants have already been defeated. Near the end of the poem, when Satan is forced to assume the shape of a serpent and to eat ashes, his allure has completely vanished. The description here of the serpent devils and laden with allusions to snakes from classical lore, including Ophion, a fallen titan. This reference relates to Satan once again, to the titans of the Leviathan simile, as well as to Typhon, for whose shoulders grow 100 snake heads, like Dante's pilgrims in the Purgatorio, who see Satan alongside Briareos. Milton's reader now sees Satan alongside the mythological figures to which the fallen angel have compared to Book 1. For both Dante and Milton, the Gigantomachy was a myth of rebellion with political overtones. In the classical myth, the giants rebel against Jove, Zeus, the supreme god. In Dante's version, the giants of classical lore are grouped with Nimrod, who Augustine called a giant, a hunter against the Lord, and the king, who with his subjects erected the tower against the Lord, which is a symbol of his impious pride. In the case of Nimrod specifically, Nimrod is introduced within the Inferno as speaking gibberish, because of course, as the Tower of Babel was constructed, the idea to unite all humanity under one state, one tower, one God, one religion, God, and of course not the God, God struck down the tower and prevented people from understanding each other. Thereby we have the multitude of languages so as to confound Nimrod's plan. And thereby Nimrod is situated among the giants. You can say, as with the angels, they occupy this weird position of being, again, titans, the preceding generation of gods, associated with that original rebellion, alluding to all of these images of Tartarus, of imprisonment, and again of proximity to the one who rebelled. But also the titans and the giants occupy this awkward position in terms of, again, relaying all of this back to Satan and appealing to be the chief lieutenants of Satan and Pandemonium. The proud and rebellious giants are linked with his historical persons, including the traitorous Brutus, Judas, and Cassius, who arrive caught in the jaws of Satan's three mouths. As the apostle who betrayed Christ, Judas represents all the members of the church who betray their faith. So too, one Archbishop Ruggieri is punished for betraying the Count Ugolino, as is Friar Alberigo, a churchman who had cunningly murdered Manfred and his son. Like Dante, Milton was embroiled in the political turmoil of his day. While carefully distinguishing Dante's Catholic poem from Milton's Protestant one, Sayers, who I alluded to at the beginning, to the many similarities between the lives of the two poets and their mutual opposition to corruption within the church. Lewis has likewise compared the political views of Dante and Milton, arguing that both poets combine the myths of Satan and Prometheus as a classical titan to condemn tyranny. Sharing of Dante, a commitment to the separation of church and state, that is a very contentious reading. There have been many articles with especially reference to Demonarchia, that Demonarchia was a predecessor to secularization within the state. If you want more of my views on Dante's political philosophy, I would regard you say that, because just in terms of the insinuation, the separation of church and state is a very contentious and intentionally misleading phrase. But that was not Dante's vision at all. Dante was closest to the idea of dualism within the idea of a superstructure of the universal empire, which was to be represented by Rome and its successors, and that the Pope could not usurp that authority, which was not his to begin with. Even though there is certainly, you can read that into it. I think again this is the problem when you have English scholars necessarily trying to read things into conceptual history that aren't there, and again maybe they're, well, they almost certainly are passing these phrases around incestuously without interrogating them. That the authority of a king does not depend upon the Pope. Dante the Florentine wrote in the book whose title is Monarchia, noted Milton as commonplace, adding, a book which Cardinal Poggietto had burned as a heretical work, as Boccaccio asserts in his Life of Dante in early editions, for in the latter one all mentions of the fact was taken out by the Inquisitor. Milton's entry, Religion, additionally cites Purgatorio as a warning of the dangers of combining political and ecclesiastical power, that the combining of ecclesiastical and political government of the church and the true minister of the church acts as magistrate is equally destructive to both religion and state. Dante, the Tuscan poet, shows in his Purgatorio and on the Reformation, where Milton cites Inferno, he criticizes the so-called donation of Emperor Constantine the Great, who allegedly gave Rome to the church and moved his capital to Byzantium after having cured leprosy of Pope Sylvester. Again, to add a lot more context to that, I think it rather unconvincing to try and tie all of these sort of political analogies to this. If anything, I'm reading the opposite, that all of these things, all of the relationships between the giants to Satan, the reason they are preserved in the well up until Coitus is because of rebellion. It is a form of imprisonment in the way that as the angels are going to be in heaven, the demons are going to be consigned to torture essentially those who have been relegated to the circles based on sin. Everything is based on structures of faith, hope, charity, and indeed obedience. It is part of a grand unity. Dante conceives of everything in terms of the structures and the hierarchy of a universal church of Christendom. How else can you understand some of his historical condemnations of certain figures without understanding it within those terms? So he is not talking about a more secularized conception of religion, especially if you have to look at Milton. Milton was not only a Protestant, but Milton was also anti-royalist as well. He wasn't part of the Cavaliers, and of course Dante is the arch-royalist. He believes in a universal monarchy. He is much closer to, if we're looking for contemporaries of Milton, he's much closer to Campanella, another Italian, than he is to Milton. And again, to look at things like the donation of Constantine the Great and things like that, so much more context is given when I go over to Monarchia, but again, it's not that simple. All of this is to say that when we look at the giants, when we look at the themes of rebellion, it is rebelling against the correct order, which is emperor, men, poets, and indeed, even when one looks at the harmonious pagans, the issue with the pagans, essentially the virtuous pagans, isn't that they were alive before the arrival of Christ, because in the harrowing, of course, Christ goes back and redeems both the living and the dead, and the kingdom shall have no end. In their case, is that they have refused essentially to accept that message, and they instead retain essentially the understanding that they had during their lives. There is an element of arrogance that compels them essentially to remain in the state of limbo. Whereas all of this again is to emphasize unity, hierarchy, the church and the state as one. And again, looking to all of the autobiographical elements that are sprinkled throughout the Commedia. Dante is accusing Guelphs and Ghibellines in equal measure. He cannot broach the idea of treason against the Lord, treason against guests, anti-Zena, treason against family, treason against party, nation, city. All of these things he perceives and condemns on both sides because he sees politics and he sees order as part of a temporal and a divine whole, a grand conception of Christendom, which very much there is no separation of church and state, but rather the two things working in harmony. I find it very interesting reading and doing so much work on Dante and finding this this ultimate conclusion and reaching the exact sort of opposite conclusion that I have. The giants, their great sin is rebellion. It is not to look at them as some sort of analogy for secularization. But anyway, I'll continue reading this article and then leave it there. Milton should look upon Satan as an archetypal tyrant who defies God, seduces the angels, and deceptively leads humanity to damnation. In Hesiod and Ovid, he could read the Gigantomachy as a classical catalogue of the wars in heaven. In Dante, he could find the classical Gigantomachy combined with biblical myth to yield commentary on political theory, Christian doctrine, and historical fact. As the commonplace book documents, Milton valued Dante's views on the punishment of sins and the corruption of the clergy, and on the necessary separation of church and state. Again, I've already sort of refuted that. Their similar experiences and common perspectives dispose Milton to adapt details from Dante's vision of the Gigantomachy in the Commedia in order to advance political and theological outlook. Indeed, Dante was very much trying to advance a political and theological outlook, but it all emphasizes down to the idea of rebellion and proximity and sin becoming. There is something interesting here, which is actually in reference to Irene Samuel earlier, which is this idea recurring through all of the circles of hell, which is the idea of metamorphosis. Of all the associates of hell, of all its denizens, the creatures that Dante chooses not to transform, to actually diminish the classical representations in antiquity, unlike what we saw with Geryon, which is the complete opposite of that in terms of a Ovidian type of transformation, he reserves to the giants. And the reason I think, again, he reserves to the giants is that the giants essentially, their great sin is rebellion against the heavens. So in that sense, their sin cannot be so easily represented in terms of a thematic and animalistic metamorphosis other than the locale in which they are chained essentially to the whirlpool of the well which descends into the lake of Coictus. All of this, I think, goes back to an interesting sort of a Promethean analogy, because of course Prometheus has many sort of analogues when it comes to Satan, in terms of a deliberate usurpation in giving the fire of inspiration to man. Within Dante's own understanding, as I read it very much in someone like Tolkien, Dante considers all of these things not as usurpation against God, not as trying to take something away from God, in which one is consigned to the eighth circle as a thief, but rather one is engaging in an act of subcreation. So in terms of the overall influence of Dante's work here and situating within the Catholic Church, that article was useful in terms of expanding upon the idea that Dante's works occupied an awkward position when it came to the prohibited works index, and the fact that because of the monarchy in particular, because of the political situation, and because of the places so many afforded to cardinals and hells and the admonition against simoniacs, etc. Nevertheless, Dante's influence, the conception of hell. I mean, I've already read Benedict XV's encyclical from 1921 in episode 1 of this Dante series. But the notions of the fixity of hell is confirmed in the legacy of the canons of the Council of Trent. The notion of hellfire, the imagery and the creative license of Dante, combined with that which was essentially the inheritance of Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica. I want to come back to the Summa Theologica because the idea essentially of denizens of hell, demons being associated with these particular sins, and there being a guardian demon essentially of every guardian angel. All of this is to go back to Thomas Aquinas, looking at the giants, situating them within the context of the Minotaur, of Cerberus, of the giants, of the Furies, of the Gorgons. All of these aspects essentially are there to confirm a Thomistic understanding of hell, the fact that one can't separate Catholicism from Dante. I primarily use Dante as a comparison to Milton to show the enduring influence within broader literature, but also to juxtapose Satan as inanimate, Satan as paralyzed, with Satan as the great enemy of heaven, Satan as the enemy, as the vehicle of ambition, as to contrast the cylindrical, funnel-esque design of Dis, nevertheless flanked by its grand dark towers, almost you can say representing a vortex on the ruins of the Tower of Babel, compared to Pandemonium again as this vehicle of ambition. Dante's influence on the conceptions of hell within the Catholic Church are profound. This is confirmed very much in the Catechism and the canons. But this isn't some idea which has been relegated to the early modern and the medieval period, because I want to finish off this discussion on the Inferno by reading a section of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Jesus often speaks of Gehenna, of the unquenchable fire reserved for those who, to the end of their lives, refuse to believe and to be converted, where both soul and body can be lost. Jesus solemnly proclaims that he will send his angels and they will gather all evildoers and throw them into the furnace of fire, and that he will pronounce the condemnation. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire. The teaching of the Church affirms the existence of hell and its eternity. Immediately after the death, the souls of those who die in a state of mortal sin will descend into hell, where they suffer the punishments of hell as eternal fire. The chief punishment of hell is the eternal separation from God, in whom alone man can possess the life and happiness for which he was created and for which he longs.